This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Sheela Hobden, and I am an executive coach and research practitioner. And in this new series, I'm delighted to introduce you to fellow coaches and researchers who share my passion for the transformative potential of research in coaching. Through curious conversations and practical insights, this series aims to inspire coaches to embrace evidence-based practices and enrich their professional journey. Welcome, hello, to this latest edition of the podcast, Research in Coaching. And today I'm joined by Rebecca Jones. Welcome, Rebecca.
Hi, nice to be here.
So Rebecca is the Professor of Coaching and Behavioural Change at Henley. And she's also the co-founder of the Inclusive Leadership Company and a chartered psychologist. So I'm really excited to have a professor on the show and to this conversation. So welcome, Rebecca. And might I dive in by asking what made you say yes when I invited you as a guest?
Yes. Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me to be a guest. I guess the topic appealed to me because my whole academic career so far has been about bringing research to people and coaches specifically to help improve practice and really encourage them to engage with research and try and make research accessible. So I guess that's what appealed to me about this topic and the podcast. It gives me an opportunity to talk about research and hopefully encourage some people to go out there and read some research and think about how they can use it in their own practice.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's exactly how I came across you. I think you'd had a podcast, The Coaching Academic, which I think I was listening to during COVID on the one walk a day I was allowed out on. And then your book, Research in Practice, which I found really useful because it was translating research into how we can actually implement it. So it's
coaching with research in mind.
That's it. Sorry. Yes. Thank you for correcting me. And we'll get some links to all of your research in the notes. Yeah, so I was thinking about what must it be like as a professor? How much time do you get on research?
Yes, well, research is an integral part of my job. So for those of you that aren't familiar with kind of academic roles and how they tend to work, most universities have what's called a teaching and research contract as one type of contract that academics tend to work on, as opposed to, say, a teaching intensive contract or a research intensive contract. So I'm on a teaching and research contract, which means that part of my role is teaching or leadership related to teaching primarily, and part of it is research. And technically 30% of my role is for research. So it's a fair proportion, not the majority, but a fair proportion of my time. But it's one of those interesting things that you need to be proactive when you work on research. So everything else that happens in my job is quite reactive. The timetable is set. So I have to be in the classroom at a certain time. I have to prepare my teaching materials. I have to attend certain meetings, often related to running our programs or other activities that we do. Whereas my research is driven by me. And if it doesn't happen, probably there won't be so many consequences as if I didn't turn up, say, when I'm supposed to be teaching. So it's a different dynamic when managing your own research. You have to kind of constantly be balancing your time and trying to make time for it, even though technically we have 30% of our time for research. It doesn't always pan out that way. You have to really defend that time quite well. So yes, I suppose that's one of the core things that I'm often thinking about, is trying to squeeze time in my diary for my research, making sure that I am working on my research projects and making progress with them. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges. And I'm sure if you've got other academics listening to this, they will be familiar with that, because it's often the thing that we talk about amongst ourselves is having more time for research is a struggle.
And I guess that means you have to be quite picky about what you choose to research, and because if your time is limited or precious, let's say, in that way. And if I understand correctly, it's not always just your own research that you are involved in as well, which adds another layer of complexity. I wonder if you'd share a bit more about the other angles.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that is really great when you get to the role of professor. You get more opportunities that come available to you than perhaps I did as an early career researcher or when I was first completing my PhD. So what I find now is people will approach me, which is wonderful, to ask if I'll collaborate on a piece of research with them. So basically all of my research is done as part of a team. I don't have any solo projects personally. So that's one of the things that I love, because you get to work with different people on different projects. And those might be colleagues of mine at Henley Business School, or it might be colleagues at other universities that with relationships that I've built over the years. But in addition to that, I also have students. So I have a number of PhD students who I'm supervising, and often PhD students will publish their research. So I'll be a co-author on their papers with them. And we even have some success at Henley with MSc students publishing their dissertations. So not every MSc student will go on to publish their dissertation research. Some, it's just not something they're interested in. But for some, that is something they're keen to do. And when they've conducted a really excellent piece of research, I think it's really great if they can publish it so that other people get to read it as well. So yes, I tend to work with lots of different people, have kind of multiple projects going on at any one time, and juggling those different projects is one of the skills, I guess, when you are working as an academic, is you don't tend to have the luxury of focusing just on one project. You've got multiple projects, but in a way that means that you can keep things progressing, because normally different projects are at different stages at any one time. So it's having a healthy pipeline is another important thing to think about when you're a researcher.
I mean, leading my own research at the moment, I can't possibly imagine trying to think of two different projects. But as you say, you build that skill as you work in it, and it really is a skill. The other thing that was striking me is that a lot of the people that I've spoken to have kind of come into the research space as a coach or coach practitioner first, and then moved into research. But if I'm right in thinking you're kind of research led, and you spent a lot of your career in research and then chose to focus on coaching. So I was keen to understand, what was it about coaching that got you so interested to research it?
Yes. Well, basically, so I wasn't a researcher before, but they happened at the same time. But when I was doing my own master's, which was in occupational psychology, I got to the dissertation point. And of course, like all students, I needed to pick a subject. And I wasn't sure. I had lots of different things I was interested in. But at that time, I was reading some literature for some of the other modules that I had, and I came across this topic of coaching. And some of the papers that I read seemed to be saying that there were a lot of gaps in the literature. This was back in probably 2010. I mean, there are still lots of gaps now, but certainly then there were even more gaps. And I thought, well, it seems to make sense to do a piece of research where there's lots of gaps, and maybe I could address one of those gaps in my project. So that was really a very pragmatic reason for me picking coaching. And I then really enjoyed reading the literature on coaching, and I enjoyed the process of doing a research project even more. And that was a surprise for me. I'd done an undergraduate degree a number of years before, and I don't remember really loving my dissertation then particularly. But for whatever reason, I really enjoyed the process this time. And that's what made me think, well, maybe I could do a PhD. I'd never thought about it before. It wasn't something that I'd ever considered. I was the first person in my family to go to university, so there certainly wasn't anyone who'd done a PhD that had talked about it. It just wasn't something I'd ever thought about. But when I realised I really enjoyed the process of research, I looked into doing a PhD, and it seemed like a natural progression for me to do it on the topic of coaching, so building on my master's research in my PhD. And my PhD was an intervention. So I conducted an experiment where I provided coaching. So as part of that, I became qualified. So I did some coaching qualifications so that I was equipped to coach others. And that's where it all stemmed from, really. And I worked for a number of years in my first academic post in a more general leadership, HRM, OB type lecturing position with some coaching modules until 7 years ago, I joined Henley, which really enabled me to specialise. So throughout that, I'd always been conducting research on coaching, although I was teaching lots of different topics. But when I came to Henley, I could focus. So for the last 7 years, I've only taught coaching and I've continued to research coaching, and until a few years ago, and I took the role of the director of the Henley Centre for Coaching. So I also kind of lead the team there as well. So yes, I definitely describe myself as a researcher first and a coach second. And my interests have expanded somewhat over the more recent years, which it relates to the business that I set up on Inclusive Leadership Company, although coaching is still a part of that business. It's how we discuss assessment results and it's the methodology that we use. So I think coaching will always be a part of my professional life, but certainly research definitely will always be a part because it's kind of my first love, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I think the love is demonstrated through the fact that you trained to be a coach so that you could research that as an intervention. I mean, training to be a coach is no small thing on its own. And then, yeah, that's obviously clearly brought a lot more interest in the coaching space. And it's making me think about, from all the research that you lead, collaborate with, and have seen, how do you decide which makes it to the kind of teaching table, if you like?
That's a great question. And there's probably lots of different things that influence whether I refer to a piece of research, whether that's to my students or even things like on social media, or I use it in one of my own research papers in the literature review. The key thing that I'm always looking for is I'm judging the quality of the piece of research. So has that research being conducted using high rigor, whether that's quantitative or qualitative piece? And there's a number of things that I would use to judge that. And depending on the piece of research and the methods used, those can be some technical elements. But in essence, one of the core things that I'm always looking for, and I think anyone can look for this, whether you've been trained in research methods or not, is when you read the piece, from a common sense point of view, do the arguments that author, that writer is telling you, do they seem to make sense? Or are there claims that don't perhaps appear to tie up with what's been done? So, for example, is there a consistency of the language that's being used? So if we take a qualitative piece of research, that's normally there to explore the lived experiences or the phenomena that's under question. It's a very deep exploration of that. A qualitative piece is not there to generalize or make claims around cause and effect. But if the writing is making those claims, then that would be a red flag for me, that I think actually I'm probably not going to use this piece of research, because for me, the methods are not aligned with the way that the research is being written and talked about. So, I think there's a number of things that I look for, but quality is one, and having that alignment between what's been done and the way that it's being written about is a key thing to look out for.
So we're saying that if we've got a study and it's qualitative, which means we're examining something, a lived experience, and that it's, if I'm right in thinking, usually fewer people than in a quantitative study. But if the paper is written in such a way that says, well, we found it in this small incident, so it must be true for everybody else, we're saying actually that's a bit of a red flag there.
Yes, because that's never the core purpose, or it shouldn't be the core purpose of a qualitative piece of research. If you're interested in generalizing your results, then for me, that needs to be done quantitatively with a large sample that's representative of the population that you're going to generalize to. So yes, that's not to say there's plenty that we can learn from qualitative research, but it's just different types of insight. So it's looking for that alignment really between what's been done and how it's being talked about.
Yeah. And I think it's also making me think about it's true for coaching in itself, because no two coaching conversations will ever be the same, and no two questions will ever elicit similar answers. So I think if we take our coaching lens when we're looking at research papers, then we can be curious about that as well.
Yes, absolutely. The other thing that has been something I've been keen on for many years now is that researchers, especially coaching researchers, but all researchers, but coaching researchers who are publishing, when you're writing about your methods, particularly if you're writing about coaching and an intervention that's been provided, are you explaining that in sufficient detail that the reader is able to make critical judgments about, well, how do I think this coaching that's being described in this paper compares to the coaching that I know in my own practice? And I think we can all be critical readers. It doesn't matter what kind of background you've got. You can all read something and think, well, does this make sense to me? Does this reflect the type of experiences that I have as a coach? And asking those types of questions with, as you say, with curiosity as we read it.
Yeah. And what do you think stops people being curious as they read it?
I suspect for some people, there's an assumption that it's an area that perhaps if they haven't had training in, that perhaps there's something that they don't know. So that's holding them back. They might think, well, I assume that this person knows what they're doing because they've published. And I'm sure they do know what they're doing, but it doesn't mean that you don't also have a valuable opinion or judgment to take as well. So we can doubt our own competence in this area. So I think that's something that's important. And I guess that's one of my other messages, is that for my students, I often say not all research is equal in quality. There are some amazing, high rigorous, highly scientific pieces of research. There's some that's less so. And related to that is, if you are reading a paper and you're really struggling with it, it doesn't make sense to you, it feels like you're kind of wading through mud trying to read it, it's often people will assume it's them. I know I did. I thought, well, I must not be clever enough to understand this piece. This is for the clever people to read this. And I guess, I've read a lot of research now, and I've come to the conclusion that, it's not me, it's them. I'm perfectly clever enough. We're all perfectly clever enough. It shouldn't be that difficult to read. And if it is that difficult to read, I set it aside and I find something else. There's plenty of other pieces of research out there that are more accessible, easier to read. I'm not talking about the results section of a highly quantitative piece, which might have formulas and all different quite technical bits in. But certainly the literature review, the introduction, there's no reason why that should be inaccessible for the majority of the population, in my experience. And so, yes, I think there's a bit of that can be there as well. So I always say to my students, if you're really struggling to understand it, just move on. There's plenty of other things to read out there. You don't need to try and read something that is poorly written. And if it's hard to understand, in my opinion, it's poorly written.
Thanks for that reassurance.
That might sound a bit harsh.
No, I think I've been there as well, and looking out for papers and then starting to read something and thinking, I can't understand this. There's too many words that I don't understand, and I can't make the sentence make sense. So I think it's really useful to share that. Actually, sometimes they just haven't been very well written, and that's a shame, actually, because there could be some really useful insights and information, but the way in which it's presented impacts how we consume it as well.
Yeah.
And I've kind of got two questions in my mind here now. One was about, and let's see which one you prefer to answer. One was about, what do you most like to read about when you are looking at other people's research? But the other one that's hanging in my mind is, with that limited time you were talking about and having to protect that time. How do you choose what you research? So I don't know which one appeals to you most.
Well, I think that they're both interesting questions. I could answer the first one probably quite easily, in that what has always interested me is when I see a study which I class, and this is going to show the kind of inner geek that I have, so that I class as having like really cool research methods. So something that they've done a bit different, or is perhaps ambitious, or I know it's ambitious because I've aspired to do something similar, or something like that. So often, regardless of the topic, if I see that, I think, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder whether I could do something like that, or that would be cool to do.
Are you able to share an example of something that would really get your inner geek out?
Yeah, I can't think of a specific project, but for example, I've always been really and I've never done one because they're complicated, but really interested in diary studies, which are quantitative. So you have your participants complete questionnaires at regular intervals, often every day, sometimes multiple times a day. So for example, it's often used with research around sleep and quality of sleep. So you would ask people when they wake up, they'd complete a very short survey about the night's sleep they just had. You might get them to complete data throughout the day and then just before bedtime, and you're really looking at trends. So for me, like just having that much data, I think is really interesting. So you can start to map exactly what is going on for those people. A study that I would love to do, and again, I haven't done yet, and partly it's because these methods that appeal to me are often more complicated, which A, makes them time consuming, and B, makes them expensive. So it's hard to do, but I'd love to do some research which really analyzes what is going on in coaching conversations. So having recorded coaching conversations at scale, because I'm quantitative, so everything's always at scale. So I'm talking about hundreds of coaching conversations and really dissecting what's happening and identifying what is it that makes a difference. And you could ask so many interesting questions there. You know, I'm interested in things like, what is the coach actually doing in the moment that creates that rapport and relationship and connection with the client in terms of very tangible, is it specific questions they ask? Is it the way that they respond in terms of their body language or whatever it might be? So that those kind of things really interest me. If I ever see anything like that, I'm like, oh, that's cool. I'd like to do that.
We are definitely on the same page on both those things, because I'm looking at sleep as the impact of coaching on sleep in my research, but not to the extent you're talking about. Yes, I'd love to, but the time. But also Tunda Erdos is one of the other guests on this podcast, and her research with using the movement energy analysis and with recorded sessions. So both of those things fascinate me as well. So thanks for sharing that. And then you said that you like the sound of both questions. So how do you choose to do your own?
Yes. Well, often, to be honest, recent years, it's been people have approached me with an idea, and if the idea has really resonated with me for whatever reason, and I feel I can contribute something to that project, then I've tended to get involved in those. They almost always have to tick certain boxes in terms of, I like it to be quantitative because that's where my skill set is. I'm always thinking, as an academic, I need to think about publication, and we need to think about, there's this whole world of journal rankings. So I'm targeted to publish in certain ranked journals. So I'm often thinking about the things that I know are more likely to get published in those higher ranked journals. So that's things like having a good sample size, doing an experiment with multiple conditions. So an experimental group, a control group, a comparison group. So I'm often thinking about these things, what will tick those boxes. I've always been interested in questions related to coaching effectiveness. And to be honest, I still am. I think we know more now than we did, say, 10 years ago, but there's still so much that we don't know. And it's almost like every research project I do, I might slightly answer one question, but it gives me 5 new ones that I want to answer. So I guess the biggest challenge for me is I'm interested in almost every research project. And that, so it's kind of which ones do I say no to? And those are generally the ones that for whatever reason, I feel they might not tick some of those boxes that I've just described. But yes, and more recently, my research is starting to move more in the direction of inclusion, because that's, I guess, where my passion lies. So looking at whether coaching can be a useful approach to help address some issues that we have around diversity and inclusion. I think that's where the future of my own personal research is going.
It just must be so difficult when there is so much out there, and because coaching is still a relatively young profession, so things are emerging all the time. How to decide that?
Unfortunately, but a disadvantage of the job is there are many projects that I have started either on my own or with other people that have never seen the light of day and probably never will for different reasons. They get to a certain point and then they don't go any further. So I guess that's the other thing. Like anything you get involved with a work, as you do more of it, you start to learn from, is this likely to be a successful project? The people that I'm working with, all of those things, because it's so disappointing when you kind of get really excited about a project, you'll kind of kick it off, you might get to a certain point, and then for various reasons, it just doesn't see the end. And so that's, I'm always thinking about that as well, based on what I've learned. How likely is this project to be a success?
Yeah, that's a lot of work to go into something that doesn't, as you say, make the light of day.
Yeah.
Even though they will have been learnings and from everyone involved, and I'm sure that anecdotally conversations happen to get that out there, but it's good that you can take those lessons to support when you're choosing which things like that are likely to get published. Something that I think is useful is to hear either a piece of your own research that you've then gone in to implement and how it's impacted your coaching practice, or maybe it's a piece of research done by someone else. It'd be useful to hear that process of the research to making its way into practice.
I mean, there's lots of different things, to be honest. 2 I can definitely talk about that are very specific, but at least what the main one that I can share, which is none of my own primary data, actually. It's I talk about it in one of my papers. It's a systematic literature review that we published in 2018 with Gil Bozza and I. And this paper was focused on the theoretical determinants of a coaching effectiveness. So what are the reasons why coaching works? And we reviewed the literature. So we looked at something like 118 studies, I think it might have been, something like that. And we summarized the key themes, and we had 7 themes. And one of those themes was coaching motivation, we called it, or some people call it coachee readiness, or this idea that is your coachee ready to be coached, or are they motivated to be coached? So we didn't actually collect any primary data on this, but this has always stuck with me. And I guess the other thing to say is important to share from my perspective as a researcher is that I feel very strongly that as coaches, we can build what we do on the basis of many different areas of research, not just coaching. So I'm an occupational psychologist, so a lot of what I do is inspired by occupational psychology. Learning motivation, so motivation to learn is a huge theme of literature in the psychology literature, and it's been similarly studied quite a lot in coaching. And the essence is that if someone doesn't want to be coached, then you're going to struggle to get the same outcomes as someone who does want to be coached. It's incredibly simple, but it's very important. And the way that I tend to use that is very practically to think about, prior to somebody coming to that first session with me, what steps am I taking as their coach to help enhance that motivation? So to help foster that hope that something positive is going to happen here, that it's a good thing that they're going to get involved in, to dispel any queries or concerns they might have about the coaching process, especially if they're new to coaching, they might not really understand what to expect. So anything you can do prior to the start of coaching to help start that psychological safety, even before you get in the room together, is going to help improve their motivation, their desire to have positive results from this, which in turn will have a positive impact.
So just to kind of clarify on the terminology there, because I don't want to make any assumptions, but so by systematic literature review, we mean we're looking at everything that's already been written about a particular topic. And then in this particular case, you were looking at themes, and then one of the themes came out around motivation and the difference between someone who wants to be coached and someone who may not. And then you were able to look at the things that you, in terms of practical implementation, you were able to look at there are certain steps that emerge that you can take to influence that outcome, which is, pretty powerful in terms of being able to support someone in, exactly that, understanding what coaching is, what it can do, because sometimes the not wanting to be coached can come from just a lack of understanding about what actually it might be able to achieve. So
yes, exactly. And I think a lot of coaches, they don't always think about, for them, coaching starts the moment the session starts. But actually, for the coachee, it started way before that. It started when they made the decision to be coached. And so their expectations, their anticipation, the way that they're thinking about the coaching, all of that will influence the outcomes they experience. And as a coach, you have some influence over that as well. So even in terms of providing some information beforehand and ensuring that people are prepared, they know what to expect, all of those types of things are going to help to hopefully enhance the motivation of the person prior to the start of coaching.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that'll be really helpful to so many people. I was wondering about, if you, coming kind of back to the research topic, if you had any words of wisdom for coaches or researchers who are thinking about getting involved in researching and coaching, what might that be?
I think there's lots of things that I could probably say, but some of the things that I often say to my students when they're deciding what to research, we often talk about trying to identify that topic that has that kind of, in the Venn diagram, has got that overlapping space. So is there a need for the research from a literature point of view? So doing some reading, looking for the gaps, and often other researchers will talk about the gaps in the discussion section. So you want to be looking at the discussion when people talk about future research, what's being talked about there. Is it the topic that you're thinking of researching? If it is, great. That probably means there's a gap. Of course, the caveat to that is ensuring you're reading relatively up-to-date research, because if you're reading something from 15 years ago that's talking about a gap, the likelihood is it could have been filled. That sounds obvious, but people don't always make that connection. So that's the first one, looking where are the gaps. The second one, of course, is are you interested in it? So if you're going to conduct a piece of research, you've got to really be interested in it, because by the end of it, there is a high likelihood that you'll be slightly less interested in it than you were to start off with, because it can be a long, drawn out, sometimes challenging process. So you've really got to have that passion, that interest that's going to sustain you through the difficult times, if you like. And then the other thing I often recommend my students who are coaches is, what will the practical benefit be for you? So how might you use this research in your own practice? And if you can find a topic that overlaps in all of those three areas, then you're probably on to a winner.
That's really useful. What we're interested in, what we can sustain our interest in, and how it will be useful to us. It's really helpful. Thank you. What haven't I asked you today that I should have asked you?
Do you know, I always hate that question when it comes up, because I don't know. I guess I just encourage people to read research. I'm sure you may have mentioned, others may have mentioned this already. It's a very practical thing, but Google Scholar is an amazing resource where you can get access to lots of articles for free. There is still lots of research that sits behind a paywall, but there's also plenty that doesn't. So yeah, use Google Scholar to try and access that. And also there's another website called ResearchGate, which a lot of academics are on, and they often upload versions of their paper that would sit behind a paywall, that you can upload basically the accepted version, but before it's been copy edited, you are allowed to upload that. So that's another way that if you can't get hold of the paper through Google Scholar for free, you can go onto ResearchGate and request the paper from the authors. So please don't be put off if you're not part of an academic institution and you can't access you think, well, it sits behind a paywall. There are lots of other ways that you can still access research for free without paying for it, because it is expensive. They charge quite a lot per journal, and I wouldn't personally be saying to people you need to do that. I think there are ways that you can access the papers for free. So yes, have a explore and see what's out there, and yes, use your coaching skills to approach the research with curiosity and ask yourself, how might I use these research in my own coaching practice?
Yeah, thank you. That's some great tips to find bits and pieces. And authors generally, I've made approaches to some directly, and they're usually quite willing to share it if they're allowed and haven't been bound by publishing conditions. So that's great. Thank you. And where can people find you? Where's the best place to connect to you and follow your work?
So the easiest place is probably on LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I post regularly on LinkedIn, including updates about research and other things that we have going on. So yes, you can connect with me there. Yeah.
And I know you did some lives there recently talking about publishing research, so they'll still be accessible as well. So thank you so much. It's been such a great conversation. I really appreciate you sharing your time and wisdom, and I hope that everyone listening has found it as interesting as I have.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure joining you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and to make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub, enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, signature programs, member benefits, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.